Well, good morning to everyone in the United States joining us, and good afternoon to those in Europe, and welcome to everyone, no matter where you are, to this seminar, which AICGS is hosting today on rebooting the US-EU defense relationship. I'm Jeff Rathke, and I'm the president of the American Institute for Studies. And I'm pleased not only to be able to welcome you today, but also to be moderating this discussion. So let me, in that guise, let me just remind everyone we will use the Q&A function in Zoom today. So if you would like to pose a question, please do that. You can think about it as you hear the excellent presentation, which is about to begin. Please make your question a question and make it as concise as possible. That'll increase the likelihood that I use it. Now, as to our topic today, the US-EU defense relationship. This has been for many, many years one of the areas of greatest potential in the transatlantic relationship, but also one of the most difficult to unlock and unpack. It has been problematic and divisive between Europe and the United States at various stages, and it's also been divisive and contested within Europe itself. So I am very pleased when we are now in a situation with the Biden administration reaching out to counterparts in the European Union and demonstrating a new openness to engagement and to having a security relationship with the European Union, that we are able to host this webinar. And I'm especially pleased that our DAAD AICGS visiting fellow Sophia Besch is going to give this presentation. Many of you will be familiar with Sophia's work. She is a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform. She has been with us for the past few months here in Washington, and she is one of the best informed voices on these topics anywhere you look. And so we're very privileged to have hosted her here, and I look forward to hearing Sophia's conclusions of her research and to then moderating the discussion. So Sophia, the floor is yours, and I'm looking forward to hearing.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I want to really start by thanking, for one, the DAAD for funding my stay here, and also by especially thanking the AICGS for hosting me and for being so welcoming and so generous with their knowledge and their contacts. This has really been a fantastic few months, and I'm really sad that they are coming to an end. Right. So let me talk a little about what I found during my fellowship, and perhaps let me just warn you that I will talk for a little while. Those of you who have been to these DAAD fellow seminars before know the format, but it's just going to be me for a while in the beginning, and then hopefully we can have an exchange. So just to give you an idea on how I plan to structure this, I want to first talk about why the EU-US defense relationship matters and why I was interested in exploring it further. Second, I want to make the argument that there is a window of opportunity for this US administration and the EU counterparts to create new and lasting structures of engagement. And I want to just take a look back at US-EU defense engagement over the last months, which were, as Jeff has mentioned, quite eventful. And I'm going to make the case that we risk missing our window of opportunity. And then finally, I'm going to lay out a few, I think, 6 recommendations for what to do next, and I'll especially look forward then to hearing your thoughts on these. So first, why was I interested in this in the first place? Why does the US-EU defense relationship matter? The obvious point to make here is that the EU is growing in importance as a security and defense actor. As you know, in today's sort of broader definition of security, which goes beyond conventional military means to include things like societal resilience, economic resilience, the protection of critical infrastructure, the EU really brings to the table some important tools. It has a clear added value on questions of economic security. It has, through Europe's experience with Russia, built up competencies in countering disinformation. It also has access to important levers to improve European military readiness, for example, through regulatory and infrastructure support to improve things like military mobility. It has, in recent years, developed capability development funding mechanisms like the European Defense Fund or PESCO, and it wants to use those to fill European capability gaps, but also to invest in defense innovation. It has announced its greater ambition in the Indo-Pacific, and it has just published its Indo-Pacific strategy this summer, though that got slightly overshadowed by the AUKUS announcement, I think the day after or the day before that. The EU has also launched a fund to train and equip military forces, and it is developing greater crisis management ambitions too. It has, for instance, suggested the setup of a rapid deployment capacity to intervene in a range of crises and without relying on the United States. Now, not only do these EU ambitions have implications for the US-EU relationship, they also, by extension, of course, affect the EU-NATO relationship. And as you know, NATO has also been broadening its understanding of defense and security in recent years. And there are very obviously opportunities for cooperation here between the two organizations, just as there are risks of conflict and of tension. And it is true that the EU's defense efforts have been progressing for a few years now, but as many of you will know, we are coming up to a critical point in time in the beginning of the next year, because I would argue that in recent years, EU defense has been struggling a bit with this divide between quite technical initiatives to fill capability gaps on one side, and then a largely theological debate on the concept of European strategic autonomy and technological sovereignty on the other side. But now member states are actually trying to bridge that divide by devising a sort of defense white book, a strategic compass, which is due to come out in 2022. And the strategic compass is just one expression of this moment of reflection, I think, for EU member states. It's accompanied by a joint threat assessment, a European Summit on Defense. It will be presented in the French presidency of the EU, with Paris being one of the foremost drivers of EU defense efforts. And perhaps most importantly, all these efforts run in parallel to NATO's own strategic concept process. That means that we now have quite a unique opportunity, I would say, to get the transatlantic defense relationship onto new tracks, to develop a narrative of transatlantic defense cooperation that takes into account new realities and that includes both NATO and the EU. And here I would argue that the US voice counts for a lot. As you're all aware, previous US administrations have traditionally been skeptical of the EU as a defense player because they were concerned about unnecessarily duplicating NATO structures. They were worried about losing influence in Europe and about Europeans pursuing diverging foreign policies on Russia or China. They were apprehensive that EU defense market integration would restrict US defense companies' market access. And this has led to what we tend to call this problematic feedback loop, right? In past decades, where the US opposition to EU defense has at least played a part in Europeans underperforming in this field. And I would argue that we saw that the election of President Trump and his administration's open opposition to alliances and to the EU played a really important role in galvanizing Europeans to launch a number of new initiatives. And now under this current administration, both sides have an opportunity, I think, to use their current good working relationship to build lasting structures of engagement that could ideally withstand future tension. So that brings me to one of the main questions I have asked people while I was here, which is, how does this Biden administration look at the EU as a defense player, and have expectations and assumptions changed compared to previous US governments? Now, I came here at an interesting time. I arrived shortly after the Allied withdrawal from Afghanistan and shortly before the AUKUS deal was struck. And the Biden administration has come into office, I think, clearly determined to reboot the EU-U.S. relationship after 4 years of tensions and outright conflict at times. And this administration clearly acknowledges the EU as an actor with important geo-economic clout and as a valuable ally in the engagement with China. And this course was reflected, as you know, in an initial flurry of initiatives to engage the EU, from the EU-U.S. summit in June to the launch of the Trade and Technology Council, which I think was significant. But what does this change in tone mean for the US-EU defense relationship? I have found that a traditional skeptical view of EU defense still prevails in some part of the government and its wider bureaucracy, where people remain protective of NATO and are distrustful of the EU, especially now that the UK has left, which was seen as a bridge into Europe and as a lever of influence. But others are more open to a slightly more independent European defense policy. They remain committed to NATO. Of course, they see the alliance at the core of European territorial defense, but they believe that Europeans should be able to take on out-of-area crisis management operations in the European neighborhood without US support. So basically, faced with the choice between a weak EU that is closely aligned with the US but useless as a defense ally, and a more independent EU that is able to take on out-of-area crisis management operations in the European neighborhood, they would prefer the latter option. And we have seen some changes in policy here already, I would argue. I think to guide this relationship onto a bit more of a constructive track, the Europhiles in this administration have already shown a willingness to move on slightly from the 2% debate as the only metric of performance, and to overcome some of the skepticism of the strategic autonomy terminology. When Borrell came to Washington, he was welcomed to meetings not just at the State Department, but at the Pentagon too. And we have seen the launch of the USEU defense and security dialogue, in addition to dialogues on China and the Indo-Pacific. And the hope here, of course, is that embracing a more constructive course will help to address the long-standing objective to fill European defense capability gaps. And you all know them, so I'll just briefly say here again that the operations in Kosovo, Libya, Afghanistan, Mali, again and again have shown shortfalls in strategic lift, air-to-air refueling, medium altitude, long endurance drones, unmanned drones, heavy lift helicopters. And though we are seeing some progress in these areas, Europeans still depend on the US. And both the US and the EU are also aware of the need for Europeans to modernize their armed forces to prevent a widening capability gap in the field of emerging and disruptive technologies and maintain transatlantic interoperability, especially in the context of competition with China. Now, I think that ironically, the diplomatic spat over AUKUS usefully served to refocus the Biden administration to address some of the internal tensions and provided momentum to devise a more coherent strategy vis-a-vis the EU as a defense player. The reality is, however, that today, almost a year into the Biden administration, I think both sides are quite frustrated with the lack of progress on the US-EU defense relationship. In the interviews that I've done, US officials have always reported that European envoys tend to present contradicting viewpoints on where EU defense is going in Washington, often going as far as to actively undermine each other. And this is true not just about debates on the concept of strategic autonomy, which is embraced by some and dismissed by others. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if people are interested, but also on specific proposals like the rapid reaction force. And people here complain that when official EU representatives have come to Washington, they have not been able to discuss concrete proposals. They have deferred instead to the strategic compass process. But because there have not been official consultations on that process, the way the US was briefed was tinted by what individual member states would leak to Washington. And US officials who have been, disappointed by EU defense efforts before also worry that the strategic compass will result in nothing but a bureaucratic exercise. They are disheartened by the fact that European defense fund budgets came in below what was expected. And they wonder whether Europeans themselves are serious about empowering the EU as a defense actor. There's a real sense in Washington now that the ball is in the EU's court, and that there was a lack of substance to what the EU was bringing to the table. And then, interestingly, what happened was that as a result of this lack of substance and lack of strategic guidance, both sides, I think, reverted back to old lines on industrial interests and market access. And I just want to quickly talk about this because it was fascinating to me. When I arrived here, the main issue that Europeans and Americans wanted to talk to me about was the EDA administrative arrangement. Now, for context, just briefly, the EDA, the European Defense Agency administrative arrangement, is necessary for the US to be able to participate in some PESCO projects with EDA involvement. Of course, one driver behind the EU's defense industrial initiatives of the past years, like PESCO and the European Defense Fund, is that the money should go to European firms to preserve the European defense industrial base. And under President Trump, the US openly lobbied against these initiatives. There were letters accusing the Union of deploying protectionist instruments to shut out US firms. And at the same time, some in the EU were accusing the US of schizophrenia for asking Europeans for more investment in defense and capabilities, but not at the expense of US defense industrial interests, while at the same time, of course, having a quite closed off defense market themselves. And since then, these suspicions of the US and also the UK and others about third country participation in PESCO and EDF projects have been addressed often. A participation agreement for PESCO project has been drawn up. The US is participating in the military mobility PESCO project already. And the EDA agreement is just one missing piece in this puzzle of market access, really. But it did rise to the top of the agenda at one point because some Europeans, most openly Paris, worry about the application of ITAR export rules to EU-funded capability platforms that contain US components. And so this delayed the process of opening negotiations between the EDA and the US, and the US in response blocked progress on the EU-U.S. defense dialogue, which was supposed to be launched many months ago. Now, the bilateral negotiations between Paris and Washington over AUKUS, I think, actually helped to disentangle these two issues. A negotiating mandate for the EDA has been granted a couple of weeks ago, and the US-EU defense dialogue was finally launched on Friday. So this was in the end a pretty petty technical issue, but it costs valuable time and resources, and it points to the lack of substance and the lack of strategic importance that was assigned, I think, to the EU-US defense relationship, and also to the ongoing distrust over defense industrial interests that always is going to risk interfering with finding a broader agreement to cooperate. So with this in mind, what should be the way forward? How can we introduce more substance? How can we create trust, avoid misunderstandings? How can we set up these sustainable channels of cooperation? I'm gonna just quickly go through a few recommendations. The first one is perhaps an obvious one, which is to make the US-EU defense and security dialogue a success. So the first meeting of the dialogue will be held early 2022 with the participation of the DoD and the European External Action Service, the European Commission, and the European Defense Agency. And now, as you may have guessed from what I've been talking about so far, I think that it is a good idea to have official channels of engagement that go beyond bilateral and possibly contradictory briefings by key European allies. I think it makes sense to institutionalize this engagement now to future-proof the relationship for future administrations that may be less Europhile in the US. I think that actually the mere fact that this forum is now going to exist is going to help create a different tone to prevent the exchange of angry letters in the future, and to improve information sharing, to just prepare the launch of some of these EU initiatives in Washington. But of course, dialogue for the sake of dialogue has only limited usefulness. So the next step has to be to devise a more substantial agenda, whether that is on crisis management, on the Indo-Pacific, or on newer defense domains. I think the French presidency, for instance, has ambitions for the EU in the realms of cyber policy and space policy, and those could be discussed and communicated in the forum quite well. I think on Thursday, I believe the French are going to present their priorities for their EU presidency, so we'll know a bit more then. Another second recommendation would be to get through the EDA administrative arrangement negotiations as quickly as possible to avoid this issue coming back to haunt cooperation efforts in the future. These negotiations which the EDA has conducted with several other third country partners before have taken months and years in the past, and we might not have that kind of time. I don't think that there's room for ITAR exceptions for Europeans here, especially because this is a congressional issue. But possibly we could get to a smoother authorization process for Europeans. In this context, I think it's useful to adopt some perspective. Yes, both the EU and the US have put in place restrictions on third-party access to defense procurement programs and to defense R&D funding, and they have in place a range of export controls in the EU, that is member state export restrictions. In the US, it's things like ITAR, but also both defense markets remain mostly open. And in spite of some of the recent Buy America rhetoric that we have been hearing from this administration in Washington, and that has concerned, I think, some Europeans, there are actually, when you look into the details, which I have done, exceptions in place for the Pentagon to deal with allies, exceptions to domestic content provisions, exceptions for European defense procurement contracts. And the US also remains a huge player in the EU market. So it would be smart, I think, not to let this issue undermine broader strategic outreach efforts. Third, I think we should use the parallel NATO concept and EU compass processes to improve particularly NATO-EU cooperation on capabilities. We're about to have another NATO-EU declaration of intent, hopefully before the end of the year, which might for the first time acknowledge a sort of division of labor between NATO and the EU. And I would argue that ideally this should extend to an alignment of defense planning processes, because the mistrust over defense industrial issues also acutely affects the overarching shared transatlantic objective of filling European capability gaps. Europeans are skeptical that if NATO gets a say in EU capability priorities, that these would end up tailored for US industries, basically. And on the other side, Americans continue to worry about the disconnect between EU industrial initiatives and EU defense policy. They worry that European investments are less about a capable military and more about a capable industry, which leads to these costly big ticket programs which do not fill capability gaps in the short term, like the 2 future combat air system programs that we're currently entertaining in Europe and the main ground combat system. There are ways to solve this. I think, for instance, perhaps both organizations could agree on a short list of top capability gaps after the compass and the concept have identified priorities in line with their respective threat assessments, and then also find agreement on which organization takes the lead to fill the priority, with the US accepting that EU defense planning is going to prioritize EU industry. I think it would make such a difference if the US were to embrace a few of the PESCO projects, for example, acknowledging that they address gaps that have been identified by NATO and the EU. That leads me to my 4th recommendation, which is to deconflict NATO-EU defense innovation and modernization efforts. I think especially post-AUKUS, we're facing the question what format the cooperation on defense innovation between Europeans and the US is going to take in the future. AUKUS established an innovation partnership with just one European ally for now. NATO has set up an innovation fund at the insistence, or one main driver was the UK, which is really leaning into this idea of think NATO post-Brexit. So we've set up a NATO innovation fund that the US and France are not part of. France, meanwhile, is pushing for the EU to become the main hub of defense innovation in Europe, arguing that the EU has experience with, civilian funding mechanism and civilian industry is important in this, and we should use PESCO projects to further defense innovation, and the hub should be with the EDA. And I think this is dangerously reinforcing an old unconstructive conversation point, but with a new twist, right? It used to be that the EU was at risk of duplicating NATO, and now I have heard a lot this idea that NATO is duplicating the EU on defense innovation and new technologies. Again, I believe that there are ways to solve this, whether that be something like AUKUS Plus or engaging regional minilateral formats of European capability cooperation. I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A again if people are interested, but I think we should address this question now in a transatlantic forum rather than pushing pet projects on both sides. My 5th point is money. I'll talk about this briefly, not because it's not important, but because a lot has been said about it already. I think one way to address some of the long-standing points of tension in the EU-US defense relationship is to insert more money into EU defense. That would increase European credibility. It would do a lot, I think, to dissolve some of the institutional rivalry between the EU and NATO and alleviate some of the defense industrial competition, even because Europeans would then be able to argue that their protectionism actually leads to more capabilities. I think it was a serious blow to the credibility of the European Defense Fund that the money allocated to it was halved during member states' negotiations on the EU budget. The US could, of course, encourage Europeans to increase their defense initiatives budget in the next budget cycle, but that won't be for another 6 years or so. In the meantime, all involved should continue to encourage European national defense spending. It's interesting in this context to look at what the next German government is going to do, of course, because slightly unfairly, not to Germany, but to the rest of Europe, Germany still is singled out in the US as one of the countries that maybe is not living up to its responsibilities in this field, even though it has invested quite a bit in recent years. And then finally, and just really briefly, perhaps counterintuitively, when talking about the EU-US relationship, I think a really important point in this actually is that the EU and the UK need to sort out their defense relationship. First, because it is the only way that Europeans can hope to fill their capability gaps and preserve the defense industries. And second, because we just cannot afford this spoiler in the broader EU-US relationship, where currently the UK is not just not functioning as a bridge between these transatlantic allies, but at times actively undermining, I think, the EU defense efforts in Washington because it is not a part of them, because it feels like it hasn't been granted enough access. And as far as the US is in a position to support and further any reconciliation, particularly between the UK and France, I think that that would be in everyone's best interest. Right. I've talked for a really long time now, and there's a lot on the table. So I'm happy to go into details and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sophia. That was a terrific presentation, and I'm sure it will spark a lot of questions and contributions from our audience. A reminder to everyone out there, please use the Q&A function and make your contribution in the form of a question and as concise as possible. While we wait for the Q&A to fill up, I wanted to come back perhaps to the fifth point you mentioned, Sophia, which is the money. And it's not only the money, it's the money, but it's also the politics of it. As someone who was a US official for quite a long time and dealt with European security issues, I think there is something in the nature of European Union politics that makes it particularly ill-suited to engaging the US defense and strategic community. In that, there is a bit of alchemy that happens. You have a European vision. Sometimes, as we've seen in recent years, main proponent has been the French president. But also you have ambitions at the European Union level from coming from other directions, such as the European Defense Fund, which took a number of years to take shape and to gain political support. In the meantime, everyone was talking about it, but there was relatively little in the way of resources behind it. And it leads to this disconnect, which is part of, I think, the feedback loop you mentioned. And so there's this promise, there's sort of the over-promising that is necessary in generating European Union-wide support for a particular initiative. And that takes place over a long period of time. And people in Washington sit around and say, well, when is this going to actually happen? We can't really engage in these theoretical issues. And that brings me to my question, and that is, what is your level of confidence that European Union member states are ready to spend the resources necessary to acquire the kinds of capabilities that you've been talking about? I think that's an area where there are doubts, and I think at times the theological disputes about NATO, EU, US, EU defense issues obscures the more fundamental problem, and that is that you have European states that are simply structurally disinclined to spend the amount necessary for the European Union, let's say, or for European countries to be able to carry out crisis management operations in their neighborhood? Is that going to change, really, just because the United States kind of gets out of the way, if I put it that way?
Yeah, that's, I mean, one of the most important questions at the heart of this, and one of the most important issues, I think. I think it is important to note that I think we're in the 6th year of European NATO allies increasing their defense budgets, including Germany significantly increasing its defense budget. And yet we're not at the point that we would like to be. So I think we are seeing progress. I understand the frustration with how incremental that progress can be. I really appreciate, I think, this administration's willingness to broaden the conversation on burden sharing and on shared responsibility beyond this output metric of the 2%, looking more at what capabilities are countries actually contributing. Are they living up to their NATO pledges? You know, if we take the example of Germany, there are questions on that too, right? In spite of the increased defense budget, Germany might struggle to fulfill its pledges to NATO in terms of the brigades that it has promised. And that is not just a question of money, that is also a question of a dysfunctional procurement system and whether that money actually gets you something when you spend it on defense in Germany. I think on the EU funding and these broader programs like the European Defence Fund, we are also seeing a really interesting tension between, on the one hand, the slightly disappointing budget that was allocated to the fund. And I completely agree with your description of having to overpromise and then slightly under-delivering. And this realization that what we might be seeing here is part of a longer-term trend that sees the Commission becoming a more important actor in the defense industrial space in Europe, which might really have, I think, significant consequences down the line in terms of market integration, in terms of really encouraging cooperation rather than, you know, national protectionism. And it's been interesting in my conversations here with US officials, but also with US defense industry, how there are people here who almost take the European Defence Fund more seriously than some in Europe might be taking the European Defence Fund, because they do see it as a sign, a symbol of a broader trend of the EU taking this seriously. Now, as I said before, the budget cycle is a 7-year budget cycle. We will have a review of the European Defence Fund, I think, in 2024. But I don't think that that will be a budget review. So for that budget to be increased, we're going to have to wait 6 more years. I do think it would still make a difference if the US, for example, encouraged in this review of the Defense Fund for the work program of the Defense Fund to include some of the projects that would help to fill transatlantic capability gaps. There are also suggestions, of course, many of you will have seen the Foreign Affairs article by Max Bergman and Benjamin Haddad, where they, you know, argue that in line of the EU Recovery Fund, the EU should borrow a similar huge amount of money to support its defense industries. I understand that instinct, and I think that would obviously really help to relaunch the conversation, but realistically, we might have to look to these incremental steps.
Okay.
Over the next few
Okay.
years.
I would love to follow up on that, but I'll save that because we have a number of questions that I want to get to. The first one comes from Barry Posen at MIT. The question is, could you recommend 1 or 2 very specific high leverage EU security programs that could deliver important capabilities in the short and medium term? He adds that he likes the EU transportation initiatives to improve the routes into Eastern Europe. So please, Sophia.
Yeah, really good question. And I think that is the kind of question that Americans need to ask Europeans, because we have a long list of, I think, over 50 PESCO projects now that we have deemed a priority. And we run the risk of, just for context, we run the risk of the strategic compass becoming another huge Christmas tree of capability, quote unquote, priorities that we want to fill. I agree with you that the military mobility initiative is one of the most promising ones. There also is the European drone. Of course, Europeans have been making significant progress, I think, in reducing their dependence on the US for strategic lift and air-to-air refueling. And that includes the planned acquisition of additional A400Ms, a new multi-role tanker transports by France and Germany. And then also, I think a really interesting initiative is the Coordinated Maritime Presence Initiative, it's called, where Europeans want to do more joint naval exercises, port calls, make sure that there's more intra-European coordination when it comes to European naval presence, possibly also in the Indo-Pacific. So those are the ones that I'm looking at right now. I think it'll be fascinating, again, to see what the French are putting forward in their priorities for their presidency, if they manage to put a bit more meat on the bone when it comes to this priority of cyber and the priority of space, where there are some PESCO projects here, but nothing really high level yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Next question comes from John Denny at the U.S. Army War College. You mentioned there are exceptions and workarounds to ITAR hurdles and other legal and regulatory mechanisms that are often cited by non-experts as showstoppers to closer U.S. and EU cooperation. What are the biggest legal and regulatory hurdles in your view, and which side of the Atlantic has more work to do?
That's an interesting question. So, I mean, the answer, of course, it depends who you ask, right? And I don't think that all Europeans...
Asking you.
I don't think that all Europeans would agree with the idea that ITAR really is as big of a problem as some in Paris, for instance, might say that it is, because yes, you do have to ask for authorization, but also yes, that authorization is mostly granted, right? I think on the EU side, the US and the UK and others take issue with this requirement that the participation of a third country must not lead to dependencies on that third state. That is one of the EU requirements. And second, that there must be no restrictions imposed by this third country against any member state of the Union with regard to procurement, research, capability development, but also on the use and export of arms or capabilities and technology. And from a UK and US perspectives, these requirements imply that a third country would lose its intellectual property rights in any new technologies or capabilities that are developed within a PESCO project, as well as its control over their future use or export. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the US has consistently exported more to the EU than vice versa. The US defense firms are extremely competitive in the European defense market, and that European firms are not as competitive in the US. I think we have about 9 to 10 times the amount worth of defense exports to the EU versus from the EU to the US. And that both markets, as I've mentioned in my presentation, are broadly open. It's been really interesting. Another rabbit hole that I went down while I was here was this idea of Buy American requirements restricting transatlantic defense cooperation. There was quite a bit of worry in the beginning of the year and then over the summer among defense industries and others that there could be domestic content requirements that would restrict the way that the US and European allies are able to cooperate on defense procurement. I think that it has been shown that the Pentagon actually does have exceptions on this and that we don't need to exceptionally worry about it. But I do think that it creates this sort of background of distrust and discomfort over defense industrial issues, which is why I do think that it is, I mean, I don't want to be dismissive. I do think that it is important that we get this EDA administrative arrangement and that we get to, official third country participation mechanisms to then be able to move on from that.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Dieter Detke, AICGS non-resident fellow. And the question is, can you focus a little more on crisis management? Because, as he points out, there is a crisis emerging over Russian policies toward Ukraine, and possibly also, and maybe at the same time, over Chinese military actions with regard to Taiwan. Are the EU and NATO on the same page, and what do you recommend to prepare for the possibility of simultaneous crises?
Yeah, so this is obviously ongoing. I think that let me just get at it from the EU perspective first. An interesting angle in this, I think, is that we are seeing a greater appreciation of the role that the EU can play in these crises that is not necessarily just a military role, right? So in terms of sanctions, in terms of economic statecraft, there's obviously things that we turn to the EU for. And whether the EU and NATO are on the same page, I'm not sure that at the moment we can confidently say that, you know, Europe and the US are on the same page. I don't think all Europeans agree, and I'm not sure that the whole US administration agrees amongst itself, right? So before we don't have a clearer course on both sides of the Atlantic, these two organizations are also just, you know, the sum of their members. I don't think that anyone is currently trying to get the EU in a place to do that kind of territorial defense that would be required at the eastern flank. I think the more convincing proposals really do focus on crisis management, and then some focus on the Indo-Pacific. And it's been really interesting to see that on the defense and security side, the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy actually does call for a meaningful European naval presence with joint naval exercises and port calls, and that the EU wants to set up security and defense dialogues with more partners, including on challenges like counterterrorism or cybersecurity, maritime security. So from that, you can sort of get a sense, I think, an idea of what kind of role the EU might be envisioning here, which is not the role that the US is playing, but sort of a supportive role to the EU's allies in the region, which I think at least shows, if not great ambition, it shows an acknowledgement that the EU's member states are affected by what is happening in these conflicts. It'll be really interesting to see in the future, I think, how far this administration, the US administration, goes in its demands for participation and alignment with European allies in the Indo-Pacific. I'm not sure we have heard the last of that yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Question from Matthias Matthijs from Johns Hopkins SAIS. How worried are EU officials about a return to power of the Republican Party in the United States, and even more so not only in 2022 in the midterms, but even more so in the 2024 presidential campaign?
Pretty worried.
I think that could be a really long presentation, a separate topic, but go ahead.
No, I mean, it's a really important question because it sort of provides the backdrop for a lot of the things that we've been talking about here, right? I certainly was astonished by how prevalent this fear was in almost all of my conversations here with US officials and US observers. And what I think really translates to Europe is the sense that this administration is operating in with a pretty narrow margin of maneuver in terms of what it is able to do. And it's sort of operating in the shadow of the return of the GOP and the shadow of the midterms. And Europeans are realizing that, I think, which is making them more worried, and which is making me hopeful that we can overcome this idea of going back in the transatlantic relationship and going back to a nostalgic past time that may just be over, and focus instead on trying to use these, now 3 years or really 1 year until the midterm that we've been given to try and future-proof the relationship and set up some lasting mechanisms and structures.
So is that when the window closes, in your view? Talked about the window in the framework of your presentation.
Right. I'm afraid that the window closes even sooner. I think the window closes when the French election campaigns start. So we basically have the first couple months in 2022 to set up now that we have a German government in place, and I think right before Paris goes into full campaign mode, and before the midterms, we have a few weeks and months to try and launch some initiatives. And in this context, we are seeing some progress already, like the fact that the EU-U.S. defense and security dialogue was launched just on Friday now.
Okay. All right. I have a question here from Anne-Christine Otto at the Federal Chancellery in Berlin. And this follows on Dieter Detke's question. With both with the growing hesitancy and skepticism in the United States and the EU with regard to overseas military missions, do you see chances for a united approach when it comes to stabilization, for example, through training missions or burden sharing with training and equipment provision? Or do you see more of a growing divide because joint missions also have, carry or require joint experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one thing that's been really fascinating for me to observe, and Christine maybe shares this observation in Berlin, is that because Germany is importing so much of the US strategic conversation and the strategic debate here, we import it from the US, from France, from the UK, and then we sort of try to find a compromise usually. But because we've been importing so much of that after Afghanistan, I think there's a real sense of questioning whether this kind of crisis management, whether these military missions have a future that is being imported from the US to Europe. And I'm not sure that that is necessarily what the US was trying to do. I think there was more a sense of wanting to pass the burden onto Europe. But now what we do see is an increased focus, if you look at the German coalition treaty and what this new coalition is planning for the military, an increased focus on exit strategies, on reviewing all the military deployments that are in place and whether they have a future, whether they are sustainable. So there's that on the one hand, a growing skepticism, I think, not just in the US, but also in Europe. And then on the other hand, we do have these initiatives like the Rapid Deployment Force that are pushed by Brussels and some other European member states, and that really, increased in momentum, I think, after Afghanistan. And what we're looking at here is this idea of a joint military force of, I think, up to 5,000 troops by 2025, which should be made up of land and sea and air components that should be sort of swapped in and out of a standing force depending on the crisis. This is all, leaked strategic compass information. We will get the whole strategic compass and the concrete suggestion and proposals soon. But with these 5,000 soldiers, this proposed force would of course be larger than what we had in the past. The battle groups could potentially be more credible. And member states would be forced to keep military units at higher levels of readiness, and exercises would presumably foster greater interoperability. But then also this initial entry force could not be fully operational unless member states were able to provide all the capabilities it needed, right? Which they cannot at the moment. And decisions on the force's deployment would again be fraught with difficulty because the force would be unusable, in my view, if member states who were contributing troops disagreed. And so because there's so much difficulty in reaching consensus here, again, I think if European countries wanted to launch a military operation without NATO, it's far more likely that they would act through a coalition of the willing, possibly authorized by the EU through Article 44, the AICGS idea, using national headquarters. The details of this, I think, require work and require political will and for Europeans to fill their capability gaps. What I will say is that it's really important, I think, to communicate them well in Washington so that there isn't an instinctive disagreement or opposition to these initiatives, which would then undermine the initiatives because there are European countries that don't want to alienate the US. And so I think it's really important that we get this tone right, that we get this communication right, which is what I think the US EU dialogue could be used for? Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's a good question.
Right. We have a question from one of your colleagues as a DAAD AICGS research fellow, Michael Schwan. Do you think that Germany might be pivoting, and I think he has in mind here the formation of a new government, which will take office this week, pivoting toward a stronger US-German security alliance, despite the falling short on the 2% of GDP spending target? As an example, the coalition agreement and future Foreign Minister Baerbock seem to have locked in the purchase of the F-18 aircraft to replace Germany's aging Tornadoes. That instead of has been a fundamental issue. And Michael's observation is that the project of a European army is dead, and Germany is trying to maneuver between US and NATO emphasis and France's EU aspirations.
Yeah. So my hope is, so anyone who has dealt with German officials over the last few years, I think, will have heard the phrase that we want to stay transatlantic and become European. Transatlantisch bleiben, europäisch werden, right? Which at a point, I think, became a bit of an empty slogan. My hope is that this new coalition will be able to fill that slogan with some meaning. And I think we have some indications in the coalition treaty that they might be at least willing to do that, because we have, on the one hand, a really strong, much stronger than many, I think, would have expected, commitment to the transatlantic relationship, and a real clear attempt to address some of the worries that Washington may have had with the center-left government coming into office, be that nuclear sharing and the replacement of the Tornadoes, be that the 2%, which we have now turned into a 3%, which is supposed to be spent on defense, diplomacy, and development. We'll have to see what that translates into in the federal budget, but presumably it translates into an increase, which is a good thing. And then also, you know, the clear commitment to try to reform our completely dysfunctional procurement system. Those are all good signs vis-a-vis Washington. At the same time, we also have a real clear commitment to France as the most important bilateral partner in Europe for Germany, and a commitment to European defense industrial projects, and trying to, you know, lift up, you know, a commitment to finding European arms exports regulations, which might be a bit of an issue with France. But in general, I think a very EU-focused way of looking at defense and security. I agree with you that the European army idea, I think it's a good thing that it wasn't in the coalition treaty. Instead, it's a much more pragmatic formulation of national armies working together. I don't know whether that means that we're aiming for a transatlantic security agreement. I'm not sure. And honestly, I hope it doesn't mean that, because I'm not sure what Germany has to put on the table, has to offer, if we're trying to whittle down our relationship with the US to defense. I think there are other policy areas where this administration and our new coalition government would be able to work very well together, be that on climate, for example. But I think Germany will be perceived as much stronger in Washington if we work with and through the EU and with our European allies, and try not to undermine European efforts whenever we are in Washington. My hope would be, again, and finally, that this government puts forward a more constructive new approach to this idea of European strategic autonomy that is a bit less alienating to Central and Eastern European member states, that includes their threat perceptions. I think we have seen some positive signaling on that front from the Greens. And if we can move forward that conversation instead of having it just be a conflict with Paris, I think we are automatically becoming more interesting to Washington as well.
Okay. Let me turn back to something that has, in a way, suffused a number of the questions and your answers, and that is a new government taking office. Just this morning, indeed, we heard from Berlin the announcement that the new defense minister will be Christine Lambrecht from the Social Democratic Party. She has been the justice minister until recently. and she will take over this portfolio from Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. And you mentioned also the Article 44 proposals. Where do you see areas of greatest promise and continuity in Lambrecht taking over for AKK? What are your observations on defense policy at the national level and inside this coalition as we look ahead to the first days of this new government?
So this is highly speculative, of course. I think with this new defense minister, we're going to have to wait and see. She doesn't have a strong profile on defense issues, but that isn't necessarily something the previous defense ministers who did a great job had. So I wouldn't discard or discount her for that. She has, I think, indicated that she is also really interested in a review of the existing Bundeswehr deployments. She's interested in sort of some internal review when it comes to right-wing thinking in the Bundeswehr, which are all important strands of work that are needed to anchor the Bundeswehr further in society in Germany and naturalize it as a tool of foreign and security policy. So that is promising. And as I've said, and as Michael has also mentioned in his question, we have, I think, seen really constructive engagement with the issue of defense in the coalition treaty. So be that on procurement, on nuclear issues, on defense spending, I think, again, we're going to have to wait and see what is in the federal budget. And I appreciate it that it's frustrating for Germany's allies that we just keep saying, wait and see, because we've been saying that after the elections to get to the coalition treaty. And now I'm telling it to you again, that we're going to have to wait for the budget. And also we're going to have to wait for the national security strategy, which this coalition has committed to writing in the new year. But I think if I'm trying to be serious here, then we're just going to have to wait what the first decisions are that this coalition is making, and to see how the defense ministry, the foreign ministry, and the chancellery work together in this, because we now have a foreign ministry led by a Green politician who has put forward, I think, the most hawkish conceptualization of German foreign and defense policy of all the parties that are in government now, very values-based, very strongly committed to the US when it comes to conflicts with China or Russia. We have SPD defense minister. The SPD has in the last government obviously been a bit more of an obstacle to forward-looking defense, but then seems committed to becoming again the party of the Bundeswehr. We've heard that from some SPD representatives in the past, so that's promising. And we have a chancellor who sees himself very much in the Merkel continuity tradition, and where we're still going to have to wait how he positions himself on some of the big tensions and conflicts that are in Germany's future here. So that is something that I'm going to pay particular attention to, is how these three houses, these three ministries work together.
Okay, we've got one last question, and that's good because we're just about out of time, but it's a short one. And that is, it's been clear that there is, of course, a French impetus behind many of the EU defense initiatives. Is there really a groundswell of political support in other European countries for EU defense initiatives?
Yeah, that's such an important question. I think it's really counterproductive that we, with AUKUS and with Paris being so forceful on European defense, we run the risk of this becoming completely bilateralized and France being seen as the main driver and possibly the only driver. And it is absolutely true that the French idea and conception of European strategic autonomy and European defense has in the past gone further than that of many other European countries, including Germany. But I think that we are actually seeing a real shift, particularly after Afghanistan, in how other European member states, be that Scandinavians or some Central Europeans, the Netherlands, look at European defense and how they might be actually raising their ambitions. The fact that, after AUKUS, which was seen by many Europeans as, a defense industrial defeat for Paris, they didn't come out very strongly in defense of Paris, I don't think that that should undermine this idea that there is a broader European support for defense efforts by the EU. And just as a final point on this, I think it's been slightly ironic that now we have a greater US willingness to, I think it's good that there's a greater US willingness to support and embrace this terminology of European strategic autonomy. If it leads to more capabilities, I think that that's pragmatic and good. But also we have already slightly, I think, moved on in Europe from this conversation, which has taken up way too many resources and think tank papers over the last couple of years, to a more sort of pragmatic and flexible approach to European defense, using the EU, using NATO, using a European pillar within NATO, but also more specialized minilateral formats on, regional formats, be that NORDEFCO or the JEF or the CJEF or the European Intervention Initiatives, which I think show the greatest promise. So this idea of a Fédéraliste Europe de la Défense isn't necessarily, it's become a bit of a straw man, but it isn't necessarily even what Europeans are striving for at the moment. I think more interesting things are happening one level below that, and it's not just France that is pushing these efforts.
Well, we will look forward to following the developments in European Union defense, especially under the influence of a new German government, which has, as you say, European ambitions, as well as a transatlantic anchor. So, Sophia, Besch, I want to thank you for the time you've spent with us at AICGS. It has been tremendous to have you here as a colleague, and want to thank you also for today's presentation, which has elicited a lot of really great questions and interest, and I think has really been instructive for all of us in Washington who take seriously the transatlantic security partnership. So thank you, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. And we will look forward to seeing you again soon for another event here at AICGS. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to everyone. Thanks.